Hello, my name is Catarina Passidomo. I am a professor of Southern Studies and Anthropology at the University of Mississippi. I am so pleased to welcome you to this special session of the 2021 Oxford Conference for the Book. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture and Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi, it is my honor to welcome Catherine Coleman Flowers to the virtual stage. Ms. Flowers is the founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, which is located in her childhood home of Lowndes County, Alabama. Since 2008, she has been the Rural Development Manager at the Race and Poverty Initiative of the Equal Justice Initiative, based in Montgomery. Ms. Flowers is also among the 2020 class of MacArthur Fellows. Each year, the foundation awards a small number of Genius Grants to quote talented individuals who have shown extraordinary originality and dedication in their creative pursuits and a marked capacity for self-direction. Ms. Flowers was recognized for her transformative work in bringing attention to failing water and waste sanitation infrastructure in rural areas, and for highlighting its role in perpetuating health and socioeconomic disparities. This work has been her life's work, and it is the subject of her book, Waste, One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret, published by the New Press in 2020. It is such an honor to have Ms. Flowers join us via Zoom today. You have the stage.
Yes, this is an honor for me as well, because I am a student of genealogy, and in my spare time, that's how I relax. And one of the things that I found out in pursuing my family history through the DNA test that I have connections to Mississippi. So I never knew that before recently. So this is indeed an honor. Also, I'm very aware of the history of Mississippi and what it means and how it factors into my story. My story begins in Lowndes County, Alabama. However, I was born in Birmingham, which was a hotbed of the civil rights movement. But my father was from Lowndes County. And in Lowndes County, there's a very, very rich history of movement um, and civil rights history. Uh, I I was very much influenced by members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. A lot of them have been part of my life and inspiring me throughout my life. And many of them were from Mississippi. One of them was Lawrence Guyot, uh, who was from Mississippi and a part of SNCC. I knew the story of Fannie Lou Hamer, which I've since found out is a distant relative. In addition to that, Joyce Latner, who I'm still in touch with, who went to Tougaloo College, was an inspiration. She and her sister, and they have Mississippi roots. And of course, as I write my book and I talk about poverty, one of the people that ran a campaign where he uplifted poverty was Robert Kennedy, who was one of the persons who inspired me. And of course, one of the famous parts of his life was when he visited Mississippi. And I think all of those things are inspirational, and you can see the influence in reading my book. So I got involved because I wanted to make sure that all of the opportunities that are available to any other community would be available to my community in Lowndes County, Alabama. I was the economic development coordinator. And as the economic development coordinator, I had to meet with sometimes federal and state officials. But I was really dismayed by the attitude of some of the federal officials that I met when I asked them about sustainable economic development for Lowndes County. And I was told that uh, that will that Lowndes County was a place that you would go through to get to Selma or to get to Montgomery. And I didn't realize how this type of attitude toward rural communities was prevalent throughout the United States. And as a result, people favored or excluded, they favored the areas that were more urban and they excluded the areas that were rural. Little did I know that as I started doing this work, that my life's work, started centering around waste because it is so very basic to any type of development. Whenever businesses decide where they're going to locate, they look for infrastructure. not just roads and bridges and how, they can transport their goods and services from wherever it's being produced to the market, but they're also looking for infrastructure like wastewater infrastructure, which is very, very basic. And the assumption when I first started doing this work was that wastewater infrastructure was everywhere in the United States of America. Like we assumed that water is everywhere in the United States of America. However, when I grew up in Lowndes County, I remember going to an outhouse. I remember using what some people call a night pot or a slop jar. This was in the 70s and early 80s in a lot of families' homes. And that was not um, addressed to where it became more commonplace where people had bathrooms until later. But what we didn't think about is what happened once the toilet was flushed. And most people, when they looked at this problem, they assumed that it was not a US problem, that it was a problem that existed in places around the world. And I was always fascinated when I looked at how people readily would give to help people in other countries, which I admire, and I've done it too, but ignore what was right in their own backyards, literally and figuratively speaking. So as when I started doing this work, I reached out to find out which foundations, which philanthropists supported wastewater development in the United States, or which organizations would support putting wastewater infrastructure in rural communities here in the United States. Um, I was pretty much told that no, this problem doesn't exist, or they were gladly boasting about what they were doing in other parts of the world. And I guess as a curious person, growing up in a rural community, one of the things we learn how to do is take nothing and make something out of it. So, but I also learned to ask a lot of questions. And as a teacher, that was very, very helpful. Actually, I used to have a sign in my class on the wall that was said the only stupid question that was the question that was not asked, because I wanted to encourage my students to engage and ask questions so we can together arrive at the answers. So I started asking questions about this, and starting in Lowndes County, people would tell me, because of my family's history of activism, they would tell me about what they encountered. And we um, got involved originally because people were being arrested. That's the criminalization of poverty. They were being arrested because they could not afford a septic system. And the popular narrative was that was given by the state officials who um, who carried out that law uh, by prosecuting people in Lowndes County was that, oh, it's because they cannot, they will not pay for a septic system. Well, they couldn't afford the septic system. And there were various factors that influenced the kind of treatment that needs to go into places like Lowndes County, because the clay soils that we have there hold water. And because they hold water, a conventional septic system in a large part of the county, and that's true throughout the United States, would not work. And as a result, people were being put in a position where they had to choose between taking the money that they made, which was far less than what we need to actually put in place the type of septic system that the state mandated, to do that, or not exist at all. It was not a fair it was not a fair equation for them. And as a result, we brought attention to that, and we were able to stop the arrest. And I worked with people across party lines. This is a very bipartisan issue. And this time, I think we have to understand, if we're going to arrive at solutions, we cannot arrive at solutions shouting at each other. We have to, first of all, acknowledge that there's a problem, and then we have to figure out, how do we correct this problem? And we need to do some unpacking sometimes to figure out how we got to the point where the problem was created in the first place. And one of the things that I've used and facilitated in my work is research. And research doesn't mean going on the internet, listening to a podcast that somebody created who has not done the kind of work in the community that they should do. And I noticed that we have a lot of people who are pseudo experts who go and collect information that sometimes is not valid, but because they have the credentials, people accept it and they don't question it. That's why we have to continue to ask the questions. So part of my work has also been engaging people in the community. and especially using the lens of environmental justice. When I first started doing this work, I didn't know what environmental justice was, although I had encountered it all my life, but I didn't have a name for it. But one of the things that I learned working with my parents who were local activists is that you have to sit down and talk with the people in the community and let them help define the problem, help you understand the problem. Then I also have them engage in finding out what, or helping to arrive at the solution. So in the course of my work, I spent a lot of time listening to people, and I talk about people like Michoud and sitting down on Michoud's porch, which I grew up doing as a child, being on Michoud's porch and listening to music and listening to them talk about the days of the 1960s and their activism. But also when it was time for me to try to define and understand the wastewater problem, I went back to Michoud and I went back to the other Michouds of the community to understand this problem. As a result, we were able to document it throughout the county. And in doing so, we did what had never been done before. Everybody talked about it, but nobody had actually quantified. And we found that that's a problem throughout the United States too, that no one has actually gone from house to house to see how many people in rural communities uh, are dealing with and coping with this problem. This problem is not just not having wastewater infrastructure. That's one part of the problem with people that are straight piping who cannot afford wastewater infrastructure. Um, Second problem are people that have paid for wastewater infrastructure and it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, it means it either comes into their homes or it goes out into their yards. And we've gotten lots of contact from people who've had paid for septic systems that are now leaking in their yards, coming out of the mound because they use a lot of mound systems. Or when it rains, it's coming back into their homes. And the third problem we found, the people that are living in towns that have that are paying wastewater treatment fees, and a part of that it may be a combination of a septic system that where you use gravity and it goes to a lagoon system, but that backs up too, and that backs up into people's homes and into their yards. And I've not only just seen it in Lowndes County, Alabama. I've seen it in other parts of the United States as well. It's not just a southern problem, but it is definitely a rural problem. It's more likely to be seen in rural communities because it's unseen. When we did our house to house survey, one of the things that we found out was that, wow, the census is not counting people. I know that the popular narrative that a lot of people live in rural communities, and that's true. However, the formula for the census basically is generally based on a mailing address. And the mailing address in a rural community could be, for an example, my mailing address in Lowndes County when I was living there is Hayneville, Alabama, but I didn't live in Hayneville, Alabama. I lived in the community of Gordonville, which was the area was called Gordonville, but I lived in Hicks, and Hicks is not an incorporated area. Gordonville is not incorporated, but Gordonville is not the city that I live in, not the town that I live in. So if someone saw my address from the outside, they would assume that they were going to Hayneville, which is about 20 miles away from where I actually lived. And that is part of the problem, I think, when it comes to planning and trying to rectify some of the things that have happened in rural communities. In addition to that, we found that we would go to a home that had one address, and at that address would be three or four different houses, three or four different households. And each, it may be a main house where the parents grew up and they own a lot of property, but the children couldn't, because it may have been air property. The children were living in mobile homes. So there may be four or five different mobile homes on that property. And if that's the case, then there could potentially be six different families that were not even counted because there was one address. So if we're going to rectify these problems, we have to find ways in which we have formulas exclusively, not formulas, going from house to house is what you're going to have to do in a rural community because that's the only way you're going to count people, unless they're part of a water system and they're receiving water. But in some cases, we found that some people had one water meter and they were all connected to that one water meter. So going from house to house is one way to get an accurate picture. And that's what we did. We received a grant And we went from house to house to count, to find out who did not have a wastewater treatment system. And we, in the process, we found out about all the other problems as well, because initially, like I said, we thought that it was just people that were straight piping, but it was more than that. And that's how we were able to define that problem. And then people also started telling us about some of the health issues that we had, which I had noticed when I moved back to the area, that some people were sick, and they were my age, and they were and younger, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me. But with this now understanding wastewater and understanding the issues that it can cause, the health disparities that it can cause as well, helps me to understand that that was just one of many, many things that people in the community, especially a marginalized community, were dealing with. So how I found out about, more specifically about the parasite problem, I was invited to, um, and I think invited is a kind word, but I was told about a young woman who was, who the state health department officials were getting ready to arrest. They wanted to arrest her because she couldn't afford a septic system. So I was invited to join them at her home to meet her and see if I could help. So I went there, and I took with me a reporter from the Associated Press, because I realized that in order for them to kind of back off of this, that would be one way to address it. And we went there, and she was pregnant with her second child. She had one child that was autistic, and she was straight piping. She lived in a single wide mobile home, and her mother lived in the house on the property. I think they had about 5 acres. And she was the only other resident that lived on that property. But she straight piped, where when she flushed her toilet and her wastewater from her home went into a pit right outside her door, the back door of her home. And when I went there, it was in October, which was very interesting, because just an example of climate change, that this is October, but this pit of raw sewage was teeming with mosquitoes. And I had on a black dress that was very similar to the dress that I have on today. And I was wearing black hosiery. Um, and I didn't expect to see what I saw. I expected to see raw sewage, but I didn't expect to be teeming with mosquitoes. The mosquitoes bit me on my leg. Like, I had so many bites, in fact, that you could actually see the blood stains on my stockings. I didn't think anything of it, because although they were nesting on this raw sewage, I mean, literally you could see the contents of what came out of the house in this pit. And later my body broke out in a rash. When my body broke out in a rash, I went to see my, my primary care provider, and I asked her for a blood test. And said, will you test my blood to make sure that I haven't contracted something? And it came back negative. And I asked her, is it possible that what I had, uh, that was, the only thing we knew was that I had this rash on my body, could it have been, could it be something that American doctors are not trained to look for? Because clearly something was wrong, because I'd never broke out in this type of rash before. And also, the test said that nothing was there, and clearly that was not the case. And she said, yes, that's possible. So in the course of that, I kept looking for answers, and and it goes back to asking questions. And in that process, I read the New York Times on a regular basis, and I read an op-ed that was written by Dr. Peter Hotez, and he talked about tropical illnesses. And in that op-ed, he mentioned the word wastewater. So I saved that article. Actually, I sent it to a number of people uh, because it kept, I couldn't get it out of my head. And I Googled him, found his email address, wrote him and told him about the issues in Lowndes County. And I asked a number of questions. And one of them was, is it possible that we have something here that that people are not looking for, scientists are not looking for, because it's not commonly acknowledged that we have this problem in the US. Out of that, Dr. Hotez responded right back to me. And and asked could I meet with him. He was going to be in Atlanta. He's in he's normally in Houston. That's where the National School of Tropical Medicine is located. So I went to Atlanta the next week. I met with him, and we talked about Lowndes County, and he said we're going to do we're going to look for hookworm. I didn't even know what hookworm was. So anyway, in the process of this, we collected fecal, soil, water, and blood samples. And we not only found hookworm, we found other tropical parasites. And that's at the intersection of climate change and environmental justice. Because what that means for the rest of this country is that as it gets warmer and the temperatures gets warmer across the US, a lot of these parasites that we didn't expect to exist in the US will be moving and marching north because they'll be able to exist and live there. And that's why it's very, very important for us to address these issues. And one of the things that that we have learned in the process, especially as we learn more about waste and what waste does, um, we now have the coronavirus, which has amplified what I was so fearful of when I first learned the details about the waste problem in Lowndes County. Lowndes County now has one of the highest per capita death and infection rates in the state of Alabama. And we're finding that across the country in places where they do lack wastewater infrastructure, that they're synonymous with high death rates. Navajo Nation is another example of that. And throughout the US, we're going to find, and probably around the world, in many places, we're going to find that to be an issue because we have ignored these basic infrastructure problems. This is, I think, this is a very, very important issue. So much so that we even contacted the UN and we invited the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty to come to Lowndes County, and this, in fact, got a lot of global attention. But this is not just Lowndes County. And although I didn't write about it in the book, hopefully in my next book, I can shed light on what is happening in other parts of the country, including in Mississippi. And I've actually gone to places in Mississippi that have the same problems that I've seen in Lowndes County. It's not just in Mississippi, it's throughout the United States of America. And it's something that we need to address. There are people in some parts of this country that are still using honey pots or the slop jars that I mentioned earlier. Uh, and the other side of that spectrum are people that are paying for wastewater treatment systems, and they are failing. They're failing because of climate change. They're failing because, for an example, in Miami, they're failing because the water tables are rising. So they're getting it from the bottom, and the soil is porous and is coming from the top as well. So we're going to have to learn how to live in harmony with Earth, and we have to develop technologies that deal with our realities, not what we want it to be, but what it is and what it will be. And I think this is an important time because now we are seeing on all levels an attention to wastewater and an attention to environmental justice. And more recently, it was announced that even the new federal approach will take into account environmental justice. And hopefully, as a result of that, we will find the type of solutions that are necessary to not only solve the problems here in the US, but to solve these problems globally. Because it's not just a toilet. We have to, we have a lot of toilets, the toilets are working. What we have to do is treat wastewater, and we have to treat it in such a way that there are some things that are coming out that can be reclaimed and reused. We have to find a way to do that. We also need to find a way to be able to identify viruses before they become a pandemic, and being able to treat wastewater, um, being able to treat wastewater in a way that we look at it as something that we just not flush and forget, I think will be a long way in finding those solutions and preventing the problems that we can ultimately have in the future. And even more importantly, I think my book is important because I did it telling stories. You know, we can learn so much listening to people to share their own experiences. And I think the rural experience coming from a rural community helped me to learn how to tell stories. 'Cause sometimes we had to, and telling stories doesn't mean telling lies. Telling stories means sharing my experiences. And then sharing those experiences and listening to those experiences, I think that it will help others be able to share their experiences, which I think are vital in finding these solutions. And if waste does nothing else, I like to see it inspire young people, to inspire young people to fight for a future. Because if we don't solve these problems, it won't just be Flint, it won't just be Lowndes County, it'll be places around the country because we're dealing with an existential challenge now, which is climate change. And climate change is upending a lot of what we believed in. And we thought that the technologies were working. And we thought that the way we build was the way to do it. And it may have worked years ago, but now it's not working. And it's not going to work in the future unless we change. So my challenge with this book is to inspire young people to find those kinds of solutions, but also to reach back to these communities and work in the communities that are dealing with these issues, because those community members, those residents, not the politicians, the people that are living in it every day, could hold the key to the solution. And I'm hoping that we can combine what we know about listening, working in community, listen to them talk about their experiences, using those experiences with them sitting at the table to find solutions. And that's the reason why I wrote the book Waste.
Well, thank you so much for that. You're really giving us just a taste of the depth of this story that you tell in your book. And I'm, as you know, I have assigned it to my students, and we're going to be reading it this semester. And so, along with you, I hope that it does inspire lots of generations of people to really re-examine things that they have probably not thought very deeply about, or have had the privilege to not think very deeply about. So I had a few questions I wanted to ask of you, and as I look at them on my screen here, it strikes me that they read sort of like essay questions.
You're a teacher.
I apologize, and I know I'm hoping that as a former teacher yourself, you can sort of understand where that instinct is coming from.
That's fine.
So, that is to say they're kind of long. So, but there aren't very many of them. So,
Okay.
My first question is about historic context. Your book, I think, really eloquently demonstrates that the problem of poor water and waste sanitation infrastructure needs to be understood within a historical context of institutionalized racism and economic and environmental injustice. Early in the first chapter, you write, quote, "I believe that you can't understand how rural Alabama wound up with raw sewage in people's yards without first learning about how African Americans were brought here as slaves to work the soil." So can you elaborate, especially for students who will listen to this, on why it is so essential for us to understand that history if we are to adequately assess and address our current problems?
Yes, I think that there are certain systems that were put in place intentionally to create the outcomes that we have now. In the U.S. Constitution, they outlawed the importation of slaves, but to replace that, a thriving domestic slave market took its place. So one of those places was Montgomery, Alabama. And in Montgomery, Alabama, people were brought in either by rail, or they were brought in by, or they were brought in by the river, because the Alabama River borders, downtown Montgomery. And there is a street called Commerce Street that goes from the river and the rail to the center of town, where they had the square where slaves were auctioned off. And there were buildings in Montgomery that that housed slaves. Some of the homes in Montgomery are built to where there are tunnels going from the river to the basements in the homes, especially those homes, the earlier homes that were built along the riverbank in downtown Montgomery. And a lot of those slaves that went there, they came from places throughout the South. I mean, I'm finding out through genealogy, which I mentioned at the beginning, that my family tree, actually, I have family members that were um, in what is now the United States before it became the United States. But largely, I'm tracing them back to Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, Virginia, and then of course it started to spread and go into to Alabama and Mississippi. So when they came in, they were sold into these areas. A lot of these areas were largely agricultural areas, Lowndes County being one of them. And at the end of the Civil War, um, the local power structure came up with ways in which they could control the labor. A lot of this is documented in Dr. Hassan Jeffrey's book, Bloody Lowndes. And they did this through racial trauma. And I have to mention here that I work for the Equal Justice Initiative as well, which Brian Stevenson came up with the idea of doing a memorial to lynching victims. And as we know, Mississippi has a bloody history like Alabama when it comes to lynchings. And a lot of people were lynched in places like Lowndes County. And Lowndes got the name Bloody Lowndes because what they tried to do was keep the sharecroppers, keep the sharecroppers where they would stay with the land. It was almost like serfdom, where the landowners got together and said, we're not going to hire people from the plantations. That kept the labor cheap and kept labor there. And as a result, we'll find that these areas where people live and the areas where people don't have access to wastewater sanitation still exist. The towns in these areas used to be mostly white, and those towns have a different kind of infrastructure than they have in the areas that were not. And as a result, we can kind of go back and trace that history, and as it evolves, you can see how things coincide with that, right? And that's probably true throughout. Even when I went to Centerville in Illinois, I found it to be very much the same. And one of the things I wanted to dispel as we talk about history and race and oppression, we're going to find that this history is pretty much reflected, first of all, people of color, but you also see that people that came from Southern Europe, people at one point that came from Ireland, were also subjected to things to keep them on the margins of society. When I went to Appalachia, I saw poor white people there who had the same kind of problems that they have in Lowndes County. So some of this is because of an economic bias as well, or rules that were written to favor people that already had privilege. And consequently, part of that equity and access included sanitation and water. So in order to understand that, we have to unpack it, and we have to know the history of what happened in those areas, so we can understand how we got to where we are right.
Indeed, yeah, and it seems that whatever injustice we may be examining in the present, it's rooted in some history that we have a responsibility to better understand. And I think you have spoken a lot today, and certainly in your book, about the ways in which Lowndes County is where your story started, and you really vividly depict the situation there, but you also talk extensively about how the problem of wastewater, of straight piping, that this is not exclusive to Lowndes County, not exclusive to Alabama or even the South. So because I'm coming to you from a Southern Studies Center, I wonder if you can talk about the ways that the problems of environmental and climate injustice have specific resonance in the South or not. I think a lot of us trace the environmental justice movement to North Carolina. So I don't know if that's something that you, if you have a sort of Southern orientation in your work, you know, being based in.
Well, you know, what I found is that a lot of these structures, I believe, some of them, and I'm going to do a little bit more research on this. I'm going to go out on them, but some of it has a philosophical base in the South. And I just remember going to West Virginia, for an example, and seeing. I just took a tour of an old mining town, and they had a company store there. And the person that I talk about it in my book, Wes Harris, gave us a tour of this company store. And the way the store was set up reminded me so much of a plantation, because in the mining towns, you know, the people lived in the cabins that were provided by the mining company. And then they had shop at the store that was there, that was owned by the mining company. And they would be indebted to the store. And the way they explained it and how it was set up, where at the top you can look out over to see when people were coming, because sometimes people get upset about their bills. And they had detectives there that would shoot someone who got unruly. I mean, just all of these things. I said, wow, it sounds so much like the South. And I was told that, yeah, the people that set this up here were from the South. They were from places like Alabama. So a lot of, and I thought that was so symbolic of the connection between climate change and fossil fuels and the way things are structured now. Our economic system is structured based on what happened in the South. Even the sale of slaves, you know, there were some famous, trading houses that were on Wall Street that made his money selling slaves. And there has never been a reckoning for that. So we have to do the truth telling so we can get to the reconciliation. But in the South in particular, we have some of the glaring examples, I think the most stark examples of environmental injustices along the Mississippi River. Actually, we can start in the north where the Mississippi River actually starts, and then follow it to see the examples of environmental injustices that have occurred along the way. And then where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico, but flowing through Cancer Alley, the area between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, that is kind of like a Disney world of petrochemical plants that are polluting the air and the water, and bringing death to those communities in numbers that are far higher than they would be if those plants were not there poisoning the environment. And what's so interesting about that I saw is that these were multinational corporations that were located in these areas. Multinational corporations, meaning that they're owned by, a lot of these companies are not even based in the United States. They're based in other parts of the world, but we allow them to come here and pollute our air and pollute our water and kill our people, and don't seem to care about that. So that is a problem. My phone is ringing. Can we pause it for a minute? But I just wanted to say that environmental justice is one of the things that I found common about not just in American South, but all over the U.S. is that we tend to see it more so in marginalized communities. And what concerns me about that is if we allow a framework where we can set a precedent for these things to happen, then we're all in danger. And all of us have to have access to clean water and clean air to live. That's the very basic. So if we contaminate the air we breathe and we can't drink the water, there will be no life. And I think we should be very concerned not only about life in the womb, but we also need to be concerned about life on Earth in general, because Earth is our womb and it's our common home. So I think if we can resolve the environmental justice issues that exist in the South, it can give us a roadmap to resolve those issues in other parts of the United States.
Well, your response there is prompting me to skip to the question that I had for you about hope, because I know that you have been involved with the presidential transition and the Unity Task Force, and there are a lot of people in high places who are talking about environmental justice where we haven't heard that kind of language for maybe ever. So I wanted to ask you about hope. This is another long essay question. So on the subject of hope in times of darkness, the historian and writer Rebecca Solnit writes, quote, "It is important to say what hope is not. It is not the belief that everything was, is, or will be fine. The evidence is all around us of tremendous suffering and tremendous destruction. The hope I'm interested in is about broad perspectives with specific possibilities, ones that invite or demand that we act. It's also not a sunny everything is getting better narrative, though it may be counter to the everything is getting worse narrative. You could call it an account of the complexities and uncertainties with openings," end quote. So I guess by way of conclusion, where do you see openings and what gives you hope right now?
When I heard President Biden say environmental justice as president on the first day that he was in office, that gives me hope. And recently it was announced that environmental justice will be at the center of the climate plan. That gives me great hope. Doesn't mean that the work is not done. It means that we have to work harder. But the way I define hope is that little bitty light at the end of that dark tunnel. And I always focus on that light, because that light is what gives me the inspiration and the motivation to keep going. Even when I face obstacles and I see mountains ahead. And what I usually do, I remember, one of the things I talk about in my book is faith. And sometimes I know that we're going to have these mountains of obstacles, but what I want is maybe not sometimes I can't climb the mountain, but I may be able to go around the mountain. And I may not be able to get to my destination at the time that I had put in my mind, but I will eventually get there if I just keep moving. And that's what hope is.
Well, you have certainly given us a lot to think about and dare I say, even hope about. So I just want to thank you again on behalf of everyone here at the Center for the Study of Southern Culture in the town of Oxford. It's been such an honor to speak with you, and I hold out hope that when this pandemic is over, we can have you here in person.
Thank you.
This is the beginning, yeah.
Thank you. I would love to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, have an excellent day. I know you have a lot of things on your plate today. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to all of us being together in person again.